Ancient Greece is often celebrated as the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and art. We imagine marble temples gleaming in the sunlight, philosophers debating under olive trees, and athletes competing in the first Olympic Games. It was a civilization that shaped the world's ideals of beauty, reason, and freedom. Yet, beneath the shining marble and the songs of poets, there existed a reality far less glorious. Among the private chambers of wealthy households, and sometimes within the very courts of kings and tyrants, lived boys and young men whose lives were not their own. They were concubines, companions, servants, and possessions. Their existence was cloaked in silence. Some were slaves, captured in wars or bought in markets, stripped of their homeland and family. Others were youths offered by desperate parents or drawn into the sphere of powerful men who saw in them both beauty and utility. Whatever the path, the destination was the same, a life where intimacy was dictated not by desire but by power. To the outside, they might appear adorned in fine clothes, sharing in the splendor of their masters. To themselves, they lived with uncertainty, their futures dependent on the whims of those who owned them. Their bodies became currency in political alliances, tokens of prestige, or objects of fleeting affection. What makes their story haunting is not only the suffering, but the contradiction. In a culture that exalted freedom as the highest good, so many lived unfree. In a society that praised virtue, so many endured humiliation. This is the story of the male concubines of ancient Greece, a story written not in triumph but in silence, in sorrow, and in the fragile endurance of those who carried their tragedy within the very heart of a civilization celebrated for its ideals, from captivity to servitude. The path to becoming a concubine in ancient Greece often began not with choice but with conquest. Wars between city-states, raids across the Aegean, and campaigns against foreign lands filled slave markets with captives. Among them were boys and young men, valued not only for their labor but also for their appearance. In bustling markets such as those of Athens, Chios, or Corinth, these youths were inspected like merchandise. Traders examined their bodies for signs of strength or beauty, their faces for symmetry, their skin for health. Buyers sought not merely servants but companions who could display refinement at symposia or satisfy private desires. For those captured, the marketplace was the moment of erasure. Their names were often lost, their identities replaced by the expectations of their new owners. Others entered this life through different routes. In poorer households, children might be sold by families facing famine or debt, transformed from sons into possessions. Some were given as tributes or gifts, tokens exchanged in political games. To refuse such a demand was impossible, and so families, out of desperation or fear, surrendered their sons into the hands of the powerful. Cultural contradictions. Greek society exalted freedom as the ultimate good, yet it coexisted with slavery at every level. To be free was to be human, to be enslaved was to be property. Within this paradox, the role of the male concubine emerged, a figure both visible and invisible. Philosophers debated love and virtue, poets sang of beauty and desire, and artists carved idealized bodies into marble. Yet for many boys, these ideals were lived not as celebration, but as control. Their bodies became symbols of prestige, reflections of their master's wealth and refinement. In public, they were adornments. In private, they were possessions. The Greeks had words for different forms of companionship: aromonos for the beloved youth, pais for the boy. In theory, some relationships carried elements of mentorship or affection, but for concubines stripped of freedom, the line between affection and exploitation was blurred beyond recognition. Their lives were dictated not by love freely given, but by the commands of those who owned them. The beginning of a life without choice. To become a concubine was to enter a world of uncertainty. Some lived in the houses of wealthy citizens, serving at banquets, playing the lyre, or pouring wine for guests. Others were kept hidden, their existence whispered but never spoken aloud. Theirs was a life of waiting, waiting to be summoned, waiting to be dismissed, waiting to see whether fortune or cruelty would define their fate. What marked the beginning of their story was not only captivity but contradiction. In a land that celebrated freedom, they lived enslaved. In a culture that praised beauty, they bore the weight of being reduced to it. Their lives began not with triumph, but with the quiet tragedy of being chosen, the household and its demands. To the outside world, the life of a concubine might have seemed enviable. They wore fine garments, dined in the halls of wealthy men, and were seen in proximity to power. But beneath this thin veil of privilege lay a daily rhythm defined by obedience. Concubines served at symposia, the drinking banquets that defined elite Greek society. They poured wine into cups, their movements expected to be graceful and precise. They entertained with music, learning to play the lyre or sing verses of poetry. Sometimes they danced, their bodies turned into spectacle for guests who laughed, jeered and whispered. In these moments they were both present and absent, admired yet objectified, their humanity ignored beneath the role they were forced to perform. Rituals of intimacy. Beyond public service lay the private rituals of concubinage. Intimacy was never freely given, it was commanded. A master might summon a concubine after a feast, expecting obedience without protest. To refuse was unthinkable, for refusal could mean punishment, beating, or sale to another household. Some masters cloaked these relationships in the language of affection, speaking of beauty, love, or mentorship. Yet for the concubine, the line between affection and exploitation was always clear. He was not free. His body belonged not to himself, but to the one who owned him. The illusion of privilege. At times, concubines were adorned with jewelry, given access to fine food, or even treated with a measure of tenderness. These gestures could create the illusion of privilege, a suggestion that their place was one of honor. Yet it was an honor that could be revoked at any moment. A concubine might one day be the favored companion of a powerful man, and the next cast aside for another youth. Some were passed between masters, their identities reduced to transactions. Others, once their beauty faded, were left to menial labor, their former status forgotten. What held their daily lives together was not privilege but fragility. They lived suspended in uncertainty, every kindness shadowed by the knowledge that it was conditional, every moment of favor haunted by the possibility of being replaced. The weight of silence. The most enduring wound for many concubines was not the visible mark of punishment, but the silence imposed upon them. They could not speak of their past, for it had been erased. They could not speak of their desires, for they were irrelevant. Their voices were confined to the roles they were expected to perform, pouring wine, singing verses, offering service. In this silence, their identity dissolved. To speak out was to risk humiliation or violence. To remain silent was to endure invisibility. And so most chose silence, carrying their memories like hidden scars. Fear as a constant companion. Fear shadowed every moment of their lives. Fear of punishment if they displeased their master. Fear of being sold if they lost favor. Fear of the passage of time, for beauty was the fragile currency that sustained them. This fear was not always loud, often it was quiet, like the tightening of a chest or the hesitation before speaking. It lived in the way they lowered their eyes, in the way they forced a smile at the banquet, in the way they learned to anticipate moods and desires before they were spoken. Fear shaped their very posture, molding body and mind into submission. The loss of self. Perhaps the deepest tragedy was the gradual loss of self. Many concubines entered their captivity as boys, carrying memories of families, languages, and homelands. Over time, those memories blurred. Their old names disappeared, replaced by nicknames or affectionate diminutives that reminded them they belonged to someone else. Some forgot the sound of their native tongue, replaced by the language of their masters. Others, even if they remembered, dared not speak it aloud. In this way, the self was eroded, not through sudden violence, but through the slow grind of daily life, until the boy who once ran free in a village or city became almost unrecognizable, even to himself. And yet, fragments endured. A whispered prayer before sleep, a secret tear shed in solitude, a melody hummed from memory. These small acts were ways of holding on to a self the system tried to erase. Fragile, yes, but powerful, for they reminded the concubine that beneath the role imposed upon him, he still carried traces of who he truly was, companions of the powerful. In certain Greek courts, male concubines occupied a place of paradoxical importance. They were both slaves and symbols, reminders of their master's wealth, refinement, and authority. To be surrounded by beautiful attendants was a sign of status, a visible expression of power. Rulers and wealthy elites often displayed their companions during symposia, where wine, philosophy, and politics intermingled. A concubine's presence was more than personal, it projected prestige. To dismiss or insult him was to challenge his master's honor. Thus, the concubine became a living emblem of influence, valued not for who he was, but for what he represented. Instruments of politics. Concubines sometimes became pawns in larger political games. A ruler might gift a prized youth to an ally, cementing loyalty through the exchange of flesh rather than coin. Such gifts were not mere tokens, they symbolized trust, intimacy, and submission. The concubine himself had no voice in this transaction. His fate decided in rooms where he was present but never consulted. In some courts, these youths gained whispers of influence. A favored companion could overhear political discussions, carry secrets, or even speak softly in his master's ear at critical moments. Such proximity to power was dangerous. It could bring favor and privilege, but it could also provoke jealousy from rivals eager to eliminate an upstart who wielded influence from the shadows. The peril of favor. For a concubine, favor was both protection and peril. While under the master's gaze, he might live in relative comfort, clothed in fine fabrics, spared from harsher labor, even treated with a kind of affection. Yet this same visibility drew envy from others. Enemies could spread rumors, accusing him of betrayal, manipulation, or arrogance. Greek history remembers scattered stories of youths whose closeness to power ended in tragedy. Some were killed in political purges, their beauty and influence turned against them. Others simply disappeared from the record, erased when their masters fell from grace. Their very survival was bound to fortunes they could not control, tied to men whose favor could vanish as swiftly as it appeared. Thus, the concubine's role in politics was double-edged. He stood near the heart of power, yet his life was always precarious, balanced between honor and annihilation. The fragility of beauty. The life of a concubine was built on a currency more fragile than gold: youth. Their worth in the eyes of masters and guests depended on beauty, freshness, and the ability to embody ideals of desire. But time, indifferent to wealth and power, passed quickly. A boy who had once been prized for his delicate features soon bore the marks of age, stress, or exhaustion. In a culture that celebrated physical perfection, even the smallest change could be devastating. A scar, a fading complexion, the deepening of a voice, each sign of maturity could reduce his value in the eyes of those who once adorned him. What had been considered an ornament of prestige was suddenly deemed ordinary, disposable. Lives after favor. Some concubines, once dismissed, remained in the household as ordinary servants. Stripped of fine clothes and ornaments, they were set to tasks of labor, cleaning, carrying water, tending fires. Their former intimacy with power was rarely acknowledged. The silence of decline erased their past roles as if they had never existed. Others were sold again, passed to less wealthy owners who sought companionship at a cheaper price. This second life often carried harsher realities, fewer luxuries, more physical labor, and less protection. For them, decline was not only the loss of beauty, but the loss of any fragile safety they had once known. A few, by fortune or cunning, secured better fates. Some were granted freedom after years of service. Others formed bonds with their masters that endured beyond youth, transforming into trusted attendants or advisors. Yet these cases were rare, exceptions in a world that prized beauty over loyalty. The silence of erasure. The greatest tragedy was how completely these lives could vanish. History remembers rulers, poets, and warriors, but rarely the companions who once walked beside them. The concubines who aged out of favor disappeared into anonymity, their stories lost in the cracks of time. Their silence reflects the cruelty of the system. They were visible only when adorned, valuable only when desired, remembered only when young. Once their beauty faded, their existence was forgotten by their masters, by society, and often even by history itself. And yet, their forgotten fate lingers as a haunting reminder. For in a culture that built monuments to freedom and beauty, so many were condemned to live unseen, their lives reduced to fleeting adornments of others' power. The silence of the sources. The lives of male concubines in ancient Greece are not preserved in monuments or celebrated in epic poetry. Their existence lingers in fragments, a passing mention in comedies, a line in legal texts, an allusion in philosophical debates. These traces remind us that they were there, woven into the very fabric of Greek society, even if history preferred to look away. Their absence from the record is telling. They were never meant to be remembered. They were adornments, not citizens, possessions, not people. Yet in their silence they still speak, reminding us of the hidden cost of civilizations celebrated for freedom and reason. Contradictions of a civilization. Greece is praised as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and beauty, but the presence of concubinage reveals the paradox at its heart. Freedom was exalted as the highest virtue, but it was a freedom reserved for the few. The same culture that sculpted marble gods of perfection turned living boys into disposable objects of desire. This contradiction forces us to reconsider the polished image of Greece. It was a society of brilliance, but also of cruelty, of ideals, but also of silences. What they leave behind. Though their names are lost, the concubines of ancient Greece leave behind a legacy of questions. They challenge us to see history not only through the victories of generals or the words of philosophers, but also through the lives of the unseen. They remind us that power always creates shadows, that every temple of marble has foundations laid upon invisible suffering. To remember them is to widen our vision of history, to include those who lived and died without monuments, but whose humanity was no less real. Echoes for the present. Their story is not confined to antiquity. It speaks to us still in a world where power and beauty continue to be traded, where silences persist, and where the vulnerable are too often forgotten. To remember the concubines is to honor the resilience of those who endured, and to confront the truth that even the most celebrated civilizations carry within them untold tragedies. And so, as we close this chapter, we do not see ancient Greece only as the land of philosophers and poets, but also as the land where young lives were silenced in the service of power. Their tragedy, though hidden, is part of the story, a story that asks us not just to admire the light of the past, but to acknowledge the shadows it cast. And so, another scroll closes. If this story has touched you, let it not fade into silence. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every reflection keeps these forgotten lives alive. If you found meaning here, a simple like helps this history reach others. And if you wish to journey further into the shadows of the past, subscribe so that together we may unroll more hidden chapters of history. Until next time, thank you for watching Scroll Historian.